The Sherlock Holmes Advent Calendar. An Odyssey Through Jerusalem by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Nora Godwin. Narrated by Peter Silverleaf. 1. The Mission. It was the late year of 1896, and the enthusiasts of a certain holiday were already busy with preparations. As usual, this completely passed by Sherlock Holmes largely unnoticed, and even for my own initiatives he had little left. In fact, he was looking for a challenging new case. The last request we received revolved around a lost cat, which we gracefully declined. Runaway pets did not seem very fitting to us and our profession as detectives. It was Holmes's brother Mycroft who was going to be a sort of our saviour in our times of need. His visit had been announced earlier. He wanted to brief us on a delicate mission of the British government. And so we sat together on a cloudy morning with tea and pastries to discuss the matter.
"You know, Sherlock," Mycroft began, "that in Her Majesty's circle of government they still think very highly of you. Of course, the unpleasant events in the course of your mission in Greece have not yet been forgotten, but I can once again present you with a very interesting case."
"Greece?" repeated Holmes with an amused smile. "Never heard of it. But please, just keep going."
"Of course," Mycroft replied, breathing deeply. "It goes without saying that the matter is to be treated with utmost discretion. No information should be leaked to the public. Secretary Chamberlain expects confidentiality, swift investigation, and minimal attention."
I was immediately alarmed. Joseph Chamberlain had been in charge of colonial affairs in the British government for some time now, succeeding Lord Salisbury. In this respect, I immediately expected an unpleasant trip to India, or even to the southern parts of Africa, which admittedly did not appeal to me very much. Holmes's ears pricked up as well when the Colonial Ministry was mentioned as a client. "Are we expected," he said, quite sceptically, "to conquer new territories for the Crown? For this purpose one should perhaps rather send the army. After all, they are more experienced in fighting against the natives who defend their country."
"Brilliant humour," shouted Mycroft, laughing. "But no, this time we want to support the locals. To be precise, the mission has been agreed on with the Sublime Porte."
With the mention of this name, it became clear to me that it had to be a mission in the Ottoman Empire. This was, in fact, a little surprising, since the relations between London and Constantinople had room for improvement left.
"You want to send us to Turkey?" I interjected. "In that case, I would rather go to Uganda."
Mycroft ignored my remark and continued.
"The situation is serious. The government of Sultan Abdulhamid seems to be losing control in Palestine, and an uprising is imminent. Apparently, the state forces are not able to keep the matter in control.
Perhaps in that case the Sultan would be well advised to redirect his state forces from expelling and murdering the Armenians," I replied immediately. Mycroft shook his head slightly.
"This is not our business."
"But Palestine is?" asked Holmes.
"Of course," his brother replied quickly. "After all, as you may have heard before, this is the birthplace of Jesus Christ. There lies the origin of Christianity and some of its most sacred places. And Her Majesty the Queen is known to be the defender of the faith."
I had to laugh. "Does the Empire now lay claim to Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth?" I said. "You're going to have to queue up behind the others. As far as I know, both the Spanish monarch and the Austrian emperor already hold the somewhat pretentious title of King of Jerusalem. The Roman Pope and the Ottoman Sultan would probably also disapprove. You don't want to send us on a crusade to the Holy Land to fight a religious war."
"Of course not," Mycroft replied calmly. "This is more about preventing the escalation of a conflict and resolving it. And the Sultan, as I said, knows of this anyways. He and the British Crown alike care very much about stability in this region."
"Stability?" I repeated in disbelief. All too often this means preserving oppressive rulership. Isn't this much more about strategic and economic interests?
I don't want to deny that, Mycroft confirmed. It is well known. The German Empire is planning to massively invest in the Ottoman Empire. A railway line is to be built to Baghdad. Of course, there are geopolitical spheres of interest from Anatolia to the Hindu Kush. We want to gain more influence on the ground, of course, in agreement with the Sultan's government.
Holmes nodded slowly. I understand, he said, but now you will have to tell us exactly what happened. So far, I don't understand to what extent detective work is needed on site. Mycroft hesitated briefly, but of course knew that he now had to give us all the details to the story.
There has been a series of attacks, he explained, on facilities of the Ottoman administration in Palestine, and it must come to an end. The perpetrators must be investigated and arrested urgently, because the population seems to sympathize with the terrorists. The crude, open repression of the Ottoman government even reinforces this effect.
And here in London they welcome the Greek uprising in Crete, I remarked with a cynical undertone. But in Palestine the given order is to be maintained, isn't it?
That's our goal, Mycroft replied bluntly, and it's to be achieved with subtle methods. Constantinople would certainly be extremely grateful to us, which in turn could form a good basis for a future partnership. We want to thwart an emerging alliance of the Turks with Berlin and Vienna before it can deepen. The Crown and the Fatherland need your support.
Of course, I was now aware that we could hardly refuse the order. Holmes probably felt the same way. All right, he replied. And then we shall see what we can do for the glory and splendor of the Empire. But I want to look at the whole thing as a peace mission. We will track down the assassins as desired, but the Ottomans will have to negotiate with them. I assume you have already brought documents with comprehensive information on the state of affairs and background? Mycroft nodded and took a file from his pocket, which he handed over to his brother.
Here you will find everything you need to know about the attacks. In 4 hours your ship departs for Ostend, after which it continues by train. Go ahead, pack your things for an English summer. This should correspond to the winter conditions of Jerusalem.
Of course, it was me who had to pack our suitcases in a hurry. So while I was preparing for a long journey to the Holy Land, Holmes devoted himself to the report that Mycroft left. Every now and then he seemed to nod in agreement, and then again he moved his head in denial. After half an hour he had finished his studies and announced, "This could be interesting, Watson. The Ottoman authorities apparently have no idea and no reliable evidence. We have to start almost from scratch. There is nothing but speculation in this so-called report. However, the attacks are depicted quite meticulously." "And what exactly do they look like?" I asked dutifully, since I assumed that Holmes had to share his findings with me. "Complex," replied my friend, who made a happy face. "The chronology reads as follows. At first there were only scribblings on facades and walls written in Turkish. 'Ottomans go home' was the message of the authors. Subsequently, the report noted sabotage of administrative institutions, committed under the heavy cover of nightly darkness. Window panes were smashed with stones, a door nailed shut from the outside, and particularly audacious, a pile of camel's dung, which was unloaded in front of the governor's house." I had to laugh involuntarily. But Holmes admonished me. "Don't enjoy yourself too soon, Watson, because after that things escalated. A military vehicle was set on fire, an officer of the Ottoman army was kidnapped and abandoned naked in the desert, and in the latest act of terrorism, which seems much more serious than the prior, was an explosive attack on a police station. Luckily no one was harmed. Any comments on that?" The answer came to me quickly. "Sounds to me like resistance to an occupation regime," I said. "You don't sympathize with our perpetrators, do you?" Holmes added. "It's not like that," I replied. "Such attacks cannot be justified, but explained. In this respect, if I am right, we can at least narrow down our group of suspects, don't you think?" "In fact, that's the way it is," Holmes confirmed. "Please continue while you're at it." I wasn't absolutely certain whether my dear friend wanted to put me to the test or wasn't so sure himself. In any case, he provoked the following assumptions on my part. Let's think about it. Who could be dissatisfied with the Ottoman rule over Jerusalem? The area is mainly inhabited by Arabs, most of whom are Sunni Muslims, like the Turks. It also unites the Sultan's all-Islamic caliphate, which makes him the protector of the sacred places of Mecca and Medina, but also of Jerusalem, where the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque are located on the Temple Mount. And this place has special significance to the story of Prophet Muhammad's enlightenment. In any case, the Palestinian Sunnis probably have no particular problems with the Ottomans. Perpetrators from this group tend to seem less likely, although Arab nationalism may well play a role. However, there are also Arab Shiites and Alawites in the region. For those groups, things are somewhat different. They differ considerably in their approach to faith compared to the predominant Sunnis.
You are a real expert on Islam, Holmes said.
Thank you for the appreciation, I replied. The acquisition of a certain basic knowledge seemed useful to me when I was deployed to Afghanistan and the Indus. However, the conflict in Palestine does not have to root within the Islam. There are also various Christian groups among the Arabs in the Middle East, and they also regard the region as meaningful, which needs no further explanation. Then there is the remaining Jewish population, after all. It was the Hebrews who, by God's will and under Moses' leadership, first came to the Promised Land. This can be turned into a historically founded claim. I conclude that these are the ethnic groups that may not be happy with the Ottomans at rule. Holmes reflected on what I said, then answered, My dear Watson, you have undoubtedly analyzed the situation well. However, you have not narrowed down our circle of suspects, but expanded it. According to your list, basically all religious or ethnic groups in Palestine are considered as potential initiators of anti-Ottoman activities. I'm afraid this did not get us any further, my friend. After short consideration, I had to agree with Holmes. My subtle assumptions did not really help us for the time being. Unfortunately, you're right, I confirmed. What do you propose? Holmes smiled good-naturedly. Elementary, Watson, we will have to start with old-fashioned investigative work, he said, and we will start, like always, at the crime scene. I am extremely confident, however, that it will not be long before we know who is behind the attacks on the Ottoman administration. Presumably Holmes once again aimed at his special detective skills, which would undoubtedly lead to quick results. What makes you so sure about this? I asked Holmes. Quite simply, my dear Watson, the perpetrators will soon reveal themselves, Holmes answered. I frowned and said, Why is that? There is no end in itself in terrorism, Holmes claimed. The perpetrators are likely to pursue political goals. Sooner or later they will have to bring them to the public, otherwise all their actions will be for nothing. This means that they will commit themselves to the attacks and make demands. A logical conclusion that had not yet come to my mind. That will make things easier, I shouted in agreement. We'll see, Holmes replied, reaching for his coat. Are we ready to leave? Have you packed everything? Our ship is waiting for us in the harbour. Onwards to a final crusade. I barely shared my friend's sudden enthusiasm for our mission. You know that the crusades mostly ended in a terrible bloodbath and defeated Europeans, I said. But Holmes was already standing at the door. To Jerusalem, he shouted, and resolutely reached for the doorknob. I sighed, took our suitcases, and dutifully followed him.